Most of my demonstrations will be done with these three pencils: the wooden graphite pencil, the mechanical graphite pencil, and the charcoal pencil. The mechanical pencil gives you more exacting lines, while the wooden pencils allow you more variety because of the side. And then with the charcoal pencil, I have it in this sleeve, and the sleeve allows me to lay the pencil down on its side to maximize the size of the pencil blade that I sharpen it to. Holding the pencil, you want the pencil as light in your hand as possible, almost as if someone could knock it right out of your hand if someone bumped it, just like that. I don't squeeze down on the pencil very hard, because the harder you squeeze on the pencil, the more damage you do to your wrist. So with a very light grip, you should be able to lay down some nice tone. You should be able to get a nice consistent edge. And if you hold the pencil sideways, you should get pretty straight lines as well. So a wooden pencil is sharpened with a point so that you can lay the side of it down and maximize the scale of the blade that you've sharpened. Much like a charcoal pencil, you can really open the blade up and get the most out of the line that you're looking for. And if you hold the pencil in varying degrees in your hand, either more towards the tip or more towards the side, you should be able to get a wide range of lines from very, very thin to the entire width of the blade. And holding the blade sideways will allow you to do more organic lines from thick to thin. We have to hold the pencil a little differently sometimes to draw certain lines and certain arcs. So there's a few different ways of holding the pencil. You can hold it as if you were writing, or you can hold it sideways in your hand like you're holding a baton. Here I'm using my finger as a pressure point, but I'm holding the pencil sideways, and by holding it sideways I have a lot more flexibility with the pencil, I have a lot more momentum, movement, and so forth. Now when you're holding a pencil with an extender, the idea is to find an extender that doesn't get in the way of the pencil. And when you're using a mechanical pencil, if you draw out the lead far enough, you should be able to pull the lines that you're looking for effectively. Freehand ellipses are quite a challenge. You have to hold the pencil sideways in order to get them to connect together correctly. And then you want to practice them at every degree possible, from a perfect circle to a straight line. You want to try to avoid the little fishtails or the overlapping edges at the very back end. And you want to try to avoid making ovals or ellipses with your hand as if you were writing. Your wrist will get in the way of making a perfect circle or a perfect ellipse. The other thing to avoid would be the football ends or the pinches at both ends of an ellipse. The idea would be to get the hand to swing an ellipse as freely as possible so there aren't any binding edges anywhere. If you draw an ellipse too many times, you won't know which circle to trace or track. And then the same thing will happen if you don't draw all the way through and around the shape. You'll end up with the lines disconnected. To draw a straight line, you have to draw from the shoulder or from the elbow, not from the wrist. From the wrist, the hand has too small a movement and will create a rotation. But from the elbow or the shoulder, we have a greater chance of drawing a much straighter line, and a longer line at that. It's much easier to draw the straight line and draw it away from you than it is to try to draw it towards you. Drawing it towards you sort of restricts the movement and makes the line waver a little bit. It's just a little bit harder to control when drawing towards you. But drawing away from you, everything is much more fluid. Now, the idea of drawing a straight line is so that you can quickly indicate things of a mechanical nature, such as a cube, and not end up with curvilinear lines. They're a little bit more difficult to, one, measure, and two, straighten out once they've been drawn in. So drawing and staggering the wrist. The first two lines I drew here were chicken scratched in, where all of these lines are now flowing. Chicken scratch basically means I'm just etching along little bit by little bit. And these lines I'm drawing are nice and fluid, regardless of its length. Whether they're short lines or long lines, I want the most fluid line as possible. The cleaner the line, the easier the read. The art of the straight line is going to be very helpful when we shade. When we shade a picture, we draw lines that are parallel, much like these. Now let's build a box, let's build a space so that we can shade in. And shading isn't necessarily done with the pencil tip. In fact, it's probably easier if you use the broad side of the pencil to fill a form. So we're going to take the side of the pencil here and start a tone, and we're going to pass it in one direction, not in both directions like this. If you go back and forth, you'll end up with tails, and with opening or with shading in one direction, you're opening up the end to make more tone connect with it evenly and consistently. These little tails that we have on our shading create a little dark mark, and that little dark mark has to eventually be erased out, which means more work. Now, if you can shade in one even coat or in one direction consistently, you don't have as much cleanup work to do, and that gives you a lot more quality time to finish your drawing. Now when we're shading, we're hatching, and hatching is a series of parallel lines. And the closer and tighter you push those parallel lines to each other, the more even and uniform the tone. The lines could be curvy, the lines could be straight, just as long as those lines create a direction. Each of those little directional lines overlapping other directional little lines create little patches, and each of these patches connected together eventually lead to a larger surface or the three-dimensional objects that we're trying to draw. Now the closer you get these lines to each other, the more evenly spaced and the smoother your tone will be. If you press too hard all at once, you end up scoring the paper, both on the back side and on the front side. You'll feel relief to it. So to darken a tone or to make the tone more even, the best way to do it is to build up a series of layers over and over again to create a nice even tone. There's another way of shading which is called veiling, and that's where you spin your hand in a slow circular motion, which my hand right now is not moving very slow, but in a slow circular motion you'll get a nice even tone, much like hatching. If you hatch in one direction, they'll both create nice consistent tones. Before we get too caught up in the rendering and the likeness and so forth, let's talk about the average proportions of the human skull. Now these are ideal proportions. These are not the individual proportions, as we each have our own. The profile of the head will fit into a perfect square, and inside of a perfect square we know we can put a perfect circle as well as an isosceles triangle, things that we can actually use to design the head with. The 4 points of the profile touch down on that square. If we start with a soft triangle to represent the skull mass, we can see that 3 of those edges are already occupied by the skull mass, and all we're looking for now is for the nose to touch down on the 4th edge. Altogether, that is the ideal proportion of the human head. Afterwards, you flesh it out a little bit further. Now, to go from the side to the front, what we're going to do is we're going to take measurements from the square. We're going to divide one of the edges of the square into thirds, and we're going to take 2 of those thirds and bring them over to our front view, and that roughly is the proportion of the front to the side. Now within the front view, rather than drawing a triangular form, we're going to draw an ovoid form or an oval, and this again is for the ideal human form.